Let's begin our conversation. I'm Rabbi Jessica Graf, joined by Rabbi George Altshuler, who has actually deserves credit, I think, for bringing Professor Beinart to us tonight. It was Rabbi Altshuler's idea to bring Professor Beinart to speak to us here in San Francisco, and we're especially grateful for you being with us at this late hour in New York, where you're located. As all of you know, if you've joined us so far, or if you've read anything about this series, this is really about fostering inquiry. And the idea behind this series that we're calling In Focus, Israel/Gaza, is an opportunity for us to hear from different thought leaders, to open ideas and to open what we hope will be ongoing dialogue in your homes and in your lives and in our community as we struggle with the realities and the challenges of a really complicated situation now in Israel and Gaza for the people of Israel and the Palestinians who are all in the area around. We're trying to figure out what this might look like and to challenge each other with ideas. Tonight will be no exception to that conversation. So a huge welcome to Professor Peter Beinart, who joins us, and let's jump into some hard questions. I want to remind you, or maybe you don't know if you're joining us for the first time tonight, in the Q&A section on the bottom of the Zoom screen, there is a possibility of submitting a question. I can't promise we'll get to all of them. We have a lot of questions that we already know we want to ask Professor Beinart, but please feel free to submit a question and we'll do our best to try to incorporate those into the conversation that we're having here. So if you find things that you completely disagree with, you're totally angry about, you're delighted to hear, you've never heard before, then we're on the right track. So please listen with open ears and join us as we try to expand our minds and to think really broadly and newly about what our world might look like.
Great. So I have the honor of asking the first question. And Rabbi Graf and I would like to start by asking you about a piece you wrote in the Jewish Currents in 2020 called Yavne, A Jewish Case for Equality in Israel-Palestine. So in this piece, you make the case that advocates for coexistence in Israel and Palestine should shift from a long-term goal of a two-state solution to a long-term goal of one state from the river to the sea that protects both Jews and Palestinians. So to start our conversation, I'd be curious to hear you summarize your arguments in that piece. And also I'm curious whether your arguments have evolved or changed regarding this piece since October 7th and the war.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And just to echo Rabbi Zimmerman Graf, one of my favorite lines from Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah is who is wise, the one who learns from all people. And so it strikes me that if you are the person in the audience who disagrees with me most strongly, then you are the person actually who was most modeling that idea of learning from all people, which is something I think that unfortunately in both America in general and the Jewish community happens too rarely, that people very frequently just go to learn from those whom they already generally agree with. So thank you. I had been a supporter of the two-state solution of partition really from, I would say, my teenage years up until 2020, so the vast majority of my entire adult life. It seemed to me a way to kind of manifest a kind of deep and creative tension within Judaism itself, which is that Judaism is both a religion that has a universal moral obligation to all people. The first people in Torah, Adam, Eve, Noah, are not Jews. But it's also the story of a family that becomes a people, our people, imagined as an extended family. So we have special obligations to other Jews, Kol Yisrael, Aravim, Zeh Bazeh, all Jews have responsibilities to each other. So it seemed to me the way to solve that would be for Jews to have a state that looked after us, but for Jews to relinquish control over the millions of Palestinians who were stateless non-citizens so they could live in their own state. And I argued many, many times this position. And as I was arguing it over the years and over the decades, the population of Jewish settlers in the West Bank kept growing. And I started saying, like many people, the possibility of a two-state solution may be diminishing because the territory of the West Bank, which would be the heartland of a Palestinian state, is simply more and more of it is being eaten up by Jewish settlements. And not just settlements, but a massive infrastructure of roads, industrial parks, agricultural parks, military bases. And a Palestinian friend to me said to me at a certain point, Peter, it can't be perpetually dying. At some point, if you're going to be honest, you have to say you don't think a Palestinian state is possible anymore. And that stuck with me. And I felt also what had happened was, in order to accommodate this massive settlement infrastructure, people were essentially defining down the notion of a Palestinian state, making it ever less contiguous and ever less sovereign. And so it was essentially simply a maintenance of the occupation in other name, with basically Palestinians controlling a disconnected set of cantons. In fact, I came across, when I was researching the piece, an essay called a column called 5 Minutes to Midnight, about the impending death of the two-state solution. And the article warned that when there were 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, it would be impossible to create a Palestinian state. That essay was written in 1982 by Anthony Lewis in the New York Times. There are now, if you include East Jerusalem, 700,000 settlers in the West Bank. And there's absolutely nothing temporary about this process. You can not even find maps that come, official Israeli maps, that even show the green line between Israel and the West Bank. So, but I was stuck because I had no alternative that I was able to contemplate. But I thought, I'm going to start to just read. And I started to read a lot of writing about essentially equal political systems in divided societies. So I read a lot about Northern Ireland, about Belgium, about post-apartheid South Africa, and also read a lot of the academic writing that has come out about Israel, which tries to envision one equal territory rather than partition. A lot of it written by the Palestinians. And as I read more and more, something that I had thought to be unimaginable actually struck me as not unimaginable, which is that the principle of equality under the law for people of all different religions and ethnicities and races, which is the principle that we are staking our own safety on as Jews in the United States, actually was not irrelevant to Israel-Palestine, but actually could be a solution, a better solution than partition. The reason I think it's a better solution is for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you have one equal state, then Palestinians, first of all, Israeli Jewish settlers don't have to leave the West Bank, which is a place that many Jews feel, understandably, is extremely precious to them. Secondly, it means that Palestinian refugees can return to their homes. Most of the population from Gaza, for instance, is not from Gaza. These are people who were expelled from what is now southern Israel. And it allowed me to answer a question that had always been nagging at me in the back of my mind, which was, how on earth can I, as a Jew, a member of a people that proudly maintained our memory of the land from which we were expelled 2,000 years ago and brought about a return, how could I possibly tell a Palestinian that they shouldn't have the right to return to their lands, whether in Haifa or Sfat or Lod or Jaffa, after 75 years? Do we really think that only we really love this place and they don't? The second thing is that in partition between a Jewish and a Palestinian state, a Jewish state cannot provide Palestinian citizens, Arab Israelis, equality. I mean, just ask the folks who stand together when you talk to them, whether they think Palestinian citizens have anything remotely like equality. A state that is built on Jewish dominance cannot provide equality even to its Palestinian citizens. And what happens if the demographic balance changes? What happens if Palestinians have more babies and you get to 30% of the citizenry, or 40% are Palestinians? An ethno-nationalist state it seems to me there's a fundamental problem with it and the principle of liberal democracy, which is under which all people are supposed to be equal in the eyes of the government and the law. When people talk about demographic threats in the United States, we think of them as people like Tucker Carlson. But that is, in fact, the very basis of the idea of a state that provides Jewish legal supremacy, even if it's within smaller borders. I'll stop in a minute, but the last point I would make was that many Jews, of course, think that a state of legal equality would be one in which Jews were not safe. But I actually think if you look at the political science literature on divided societies, which Israel-Palestine obviously is, you find that those societies are more peaceful for everyone when everyone has a voice in government. And they tend to be most violent when one group is locked out of government. And perhaps this resonated with me particularly because I'm the child of South Africans. I spent part of my childhood in apartheid South Africa. And virtually all white South Africans believed that if the apartheid state ended and you didn't have a state that was designed to preserve white domination, that white people would be slaughtered. It was considered self-evident to the vast majority of white South Africans because the ANC was an armed organization. They were carrying out military attacks funded by the Soviet Union. But what happened was that when Black people got the vote, then the ANC's military wing disbanded because Black South Africans didn't actually want to kill or be killed. They wanted to have a voice in government. And when they had a voice in government that they could express themselves peacefully, then in fact, the violence went way down. Same thing in Northern Ireland, where the IRA was blowing up department stores in Britain, but the IRA's military wing disbanded when Catholics got political equality. Think how much more violent America would have been if Black Americans hadn't gotten the vote in the 1960s. So that's the basic, in a nutshell, my argument about why I came to support the idea of one equal state.
So I want to hear more. You're laying out this really incredible vision of what theoretically this might, feel like, be like based on equality. But practically speaking, how does this work?
We are nowhere near practically this happening. We're also nowhere near a two-state solution either. I mean, I think where we are, if people want to know what's practical today, I would say where we are is a state where millions of Palestinians are under the control of a state that denies them basic rights. And I think a state that is engaged in, there are strong elements of this state that would like to reduce that population through an act of mass expulsion. And I actually think the possibilities of an act of mass expulsion of the population from Gaza is very real. It could happen this year. So I think that is the strategy of large elements of the Israeli government. That's what they would like to do. Essentially, to put it in American terms, to move towards reducing the Palestinian population to the status of Native Americans in the United States, in which they're essentially no longer a problem because there are just not that many of them left, at least not left within the borders. I think that the reason that I think that oddly, one equal state might over the long term be more practical than two states or more achievable, even though they're both very far away, is that the only thing that I think will change, the thing that ultimately I think is, if anything will change the situation for the better, I think it will be a mass movement with a moral vision akin to the great moral movements of the 20th century, the movement against apartheid, the movement for civil rights in the United States. And those movements are all based on the principle of human equality. They were not based on partition into ethno-nationalist states. And that principle has tremendous moral power around the world. And I think that if the Palestinian national movement moves away from the vision of partition that it embraced in 1988 and towards the vision of equality in one state, I actually think it could capture the imagination of the world and be the basis for a kind of loving moral pressure on Israel, again, of the kind that we saw in our own country, that I think ultimately could change the dynamics in Israel, especially if international pressure makes Israelis realize that the status quo, which is an apartheid status quo, as defined by Israel's own human rights organizations, is no longer sustainable.
But so is there actually a Palestinian presence of people who have a practical vision of how this might work and have equality at the basis of a one-state solution?
Well, a lot of the people who really influenced me when I was writing are Palestinian writers. So, for instance, Edward Said, although he had supported two states, by the end of his life, came to support one state. What's fascinating is actually that Said, near the end of his life, essentially picked up the vision that I identify with, which was the vision of cultural non-state Zionists like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and Henrietta Szold in the 1940s, who opposed the Jewish state in the 1940s and favored one equal binational state. That was actually the position that Said articulated near the end of his life. He wrote a wonderful essay in 1999 arguing this in the New York Times Magazine. Ali Abu Nima, who's a pretty influential Palestinian-American writer, wrote an entire book in 2007 called One Country, in which he proposed a country that would be called Israel-Palestine in Hebrew and Palestine-Israel in Arabic. Youssef Munayar, a friend of mine, another influential Palestinian writer, wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs a few years ago called They're called About One State. So there've been a lot of Palestinians who've written this. In terms of Palestinian politics right now I think is fairly broken. But if you look at the Palestinians who have the vote, again, those are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, we call Arab Israelis. And you look at their political parties they vote for, Hadash and Balad, what you see is that the vision that those parties articulate inside Israel is what they call a state for all its citizens. In fact, a whole series of Palestinian members of Knesset introduced legislation in 2018 to the Knesset saying that this should be a state, Israel, based on the principle of treating all people equally, irrespective of their religion or their ethnicity or race. It was not even brought to the floor by the Knesset because it was considered to violate Israel's basic laws. But that's what Palestinian citizens are advocating for when they have the right to vote. And so I think that that's a sign, I think, of the appeal of this vision. I think that would be the kind of vision that I think the folks that Standing Together would embrace in terms of what they're fighting for.
I'd be curious to hear how you, or whether you see people on the Jewish side arguing for something like this vision. And I know they're Standing Together and perhaps some other organizations that are more outside of the mainstream in Israel, but like what evidence do you see on the Jewish side that this is a practical or realizable solution?
So, I mean, there are, I think, some remarkable people who do support this. For instance, Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who is someone I admire a lot, who's a settler, a West Bank rabbi, Orthodox rabbi in the West Bank, who actually began to interact with his Palestinian neighbors and came to the realization that he didn't want to leave the territory, but he recognized the necessity of treating Palestinians equally. But no, this is an extremely marginal idea in Israel. But let's remember, people who have become used to group supremacy, and I know group supremacy might sound like, scary and mean language, but that actually is the fundamental principle on which Israel is based. Jewish supremacy, that this is a state built for Jews. And that's why even among most of the Palestinians under Israeli control don't even have citizenship, and even the ones who do have citizenship have a very, very profound kind of second-class citizenship, which I could get into if people want to talk more about it. And people whose lives have been structured by the principle of group supremacy almost always historically tend to view equality as their subjugation, if not their annihilation. Just think about how most white Southerners thought about the prospect of Black equality in the South. They saw it as a profound threat to their existence, as did white South Africans, as did Protestants in Northern Ireland. Hell, many white Americans today in America see the prospect of genuine equality as a profound threat. So it's not surprising. People don't give up that legal supremacy because they just wake up and decide it's a bad idea. They give it up because they're forced by events to recognize that the status quo is untenable. And then they become open to people who make the argument, in fact, that equality could be liberating for them. This is, I think, the key thing that people like King and Mandela, others made, which was that that equality would not only be liberating for the oppressed, but a form of liberation for the oppressor as well. And I think that's the case that I and some Palestinians are trying to make in this case as well.
So just back to my earlier question, I mean, lots of, if this ever were to happen, lots of huge challenges to overcome on a practical level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are right-wing folks in both peoples that would have to agree to something like this. There's a question of population imbalance. There are all kinds of questions. What do you think this might look like? How could it practically work?
It's interesting. People often say to me, but there would be a Palestinian majority. And I say, but there's already a Palestinian majority. Palestinians are already a slight majority of the people between the river and the sea. So the problem that people are pointing to is that those Palestinians would get the vote, right? And so the point that I make is actually, I think Palestinians are more of a threat to Israel if they're locked out of a voice in government than if they are given a voice in government. And the example that I would point to particularly is compare Palestinian citizens of Israel, we call Arab Israelis, to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. There is much less armed resistance by Palestinian citizens of Israel, even though it's the same population. They're just the ones who happened to not get expelled in 1948. Why is that? I think the reason is that even though they suffer a lot of discrimination, because they have citizenship and some voice in government, they have some mechanism for appealing to the state other than armed resistance. Whereas, when Palestinians in Gaza in 2018 marched towards the fence, they were shot en masse, right? And I think so. The point that I would argue to people is that actually the Palestinians are going to be there one way or another unless you're willing to try to expel them en masse. And actually, those Palestinians who you have enfranchised are less of a threat to you, because the vast majority of people, yes, there are right-wingers and left-wingers, but the vast majority of people really would rather not put their own lives, the lives of their children, in danger. They would rather the government respond to their needs through a nonviolent process. And it's interesting when we talk about right and left wing, it's also fascinating, right? Because when we talk about left and right among Palestinians and Israeli Jews, that means a whole bunch of things. The Palestinian political party, for instance, Ram, which joined the prior Israeli government under Naftali Bennett, this is the party under Mansour Abbas, was not, as we would naturally consider it, a left-wing party. Mansour Abbas's Ram party, which joined the government, is an Islamist party. And one of the reasons that they broke away from the other Palestinian political parties was over the issue of LGBT rights, right? And so what you had actually was that a kind of right-wing Palestinian party, very socially conservative, made common cause with some Jewish parties that had also socially conservative values. And I think that's what would happen if it was one equal state, if there was politics. You would see that Palestinian and Jewish are not people's only identities. That you would find that labor activists, Jews and Palestinians, came together politically, that business owners came together around an agenda. Again, that people who were socially conservative across religious lines came together. And that, to me, is the vision that I would like to foresee.
So you started by saying that you see both the two-state solution and a potential one-state solution as very far away, as not going to happen anytime soon. So given that, can you talk about why advocating for a one-state solution, what the benefits of that are in the short term?
Look, I think in the short term we're very, very far away from this, but I do think it's the two-state solution, the prism of the two-state solution, I think right now prevents us from actually being able to think more to face the realities that actually exist. So, to give an example, the Palestinian national movement historically supported one state, what the PLO called the Secular Democratic Palestine. In 1988, it shifted to support the idea of partition into two states. But the truth is, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO is a defunct organization now, and the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas has no legitimacy whatsoever, hasn't had an election since 2006. And so it seems to me that what needs to happen is that Palestinians themselves need to be able to go through a process in which they think about what it is, how they want their rights to be manifested. And Palestinians there's a lot of evidence that younger generation of Palestinians have lost faith in the idea of two states, and also that a lot of younger Palestinians don't want a Palestinian state for the sake of their own state. They don't want to live in a Palestinian state that looks like Egypt. What they want is human rights, equality under the law, due process, actually a lot of the same things that Israeli Jews enjoy. And so allowing us to think outside of this prison, I think, allows us to ask the question, what do Palestinians actually want? And I think if we have a democratic process among Palestinians, I think we may actually find that most Palestinians do not support the idea of two states.
So you wrote this article in 2020, and here we find ourselves in 2024. How has your vision changed post October 7th, if at all? And what do you see as kind of immediate next steps towards some kind of a peaceful resolution?
I mean, what I wrote in that essay was that I feared that what would happen was that as Israel made its control over Palestinians more and more permanent, and the Palestinian strategy of collaboration, which has been the Palestinian Authority strategy since really roughly 2005, which was to work with Israel to try to make sure that there wasn't much armed resistance from the West Bank, in hopes of reassuring Israel that Palestinians could be trusted with their own state. As that eroded because it's not working, that actually Palestinian support for armed resistance would increase, and we would see more violence. And I worried that Israel would respond to that violence by moving towards the idea of another act of mass expulsion. Israel was founded on an act of mass expulsion in 1948. It was another act of mass expulsion in 1967, where several 100,000 more Palestinians were expelled. And I think that is actually where we're headed. I think that the way I think about this moment is that Hamas did something horrifying on October 7th, something which violates the rules of war, something which is just frankly immoral, to kill civilians. And I have really no tolerance for people who justify attacks on civilians. But Israel's fundamental problem, I don't think Hamas is Israel's fundamental problem. Because Palestinians have been committing arms of resistance against Israel, including armed resistance, since long before there was a Hamas. If you think about the armed resistance of the 1970s, the Ma'alot massacre of Israeli school children in 1974, the Munich Olympics massacre, the hijackings, none of those were carried out by Hamas. Hamas didn't exist. It wasn't created until 1987. They weren't carried out by Islamist groups. They were carried out by nationalist and leftist groups. If somehow you could destroy Hamas, which I think most military officials and most US government officials think is impossible, but even if you could, you would not end Palestinian armed resistance. In fact, one of the things that terrifies me is that out of this extraordinary amount of slaughter in Gaza, I think what you are producing is an even greater appetite for Palestinian armed resistance, because the instinct for revenge is human. And we know it's not noble, but it's human. And we know that Hamas recruits its fighters from the families of people Israel has killed. Can you just imagine the number of people now who would be potential recruits for another armed group? So it seems to me, if we want to make sure that that kind of horror that we experienced on October 7th doesn't happen, but we recognize that Palestinians are going to resist their oppression, because that's human. All human beings resist their oppression. The critical thing for us to do is to show Palestinians that ethical forms of resistance is resistance that abides by international law, that can succeed, right? And that it seems to me the more one fears another October 7th, the more one is revolted by what happened on October 7th, the more one has to ask oneself, what forms of ethical resistance will you support? Will you support efforts at the United Nations? Will you support efforts in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice? Will you support efforts to condition American military aid? Will you support efforts of boycott, divestment, and sanction? If your answer is no, which has been the answer of the US and the Israeli government, that you're actually going to defeat those things, if not criminalize those things, you are actually creating an environment in which Palestinians are more likely to turn to armed resistance, because they've seen that those other forms of resistance don't work. So that's the basic framework in which I think about the fundamental problem that Israel has.
I want to get to a question from the audience. One of our congregants, David, asks, both the Israelis and the Palestinians have an absolutist wing, Hamas and the Israeli ultra-right. How do we get them to buy into a solution that is anathema to them?
I think that the political parties do respond to public opinion of their people. And even if you look at Hamas's behavior, I would recommend people read Tariq Bakoni's book, Hamas Contained, which is probably kind of, I think, considered the most authoritative recent book that there is written on Hamas. You see how Hamas at various points has tried to respond to what it perceived as Palestinian public opinion, which is why there was a period of time where Hamas was saying, well, we don't believe that Israel is legitimate by any means, but if the Palestinian people, if there is a consensus among Palestinians for the idea of two states, then we would essentially accept that because it was the consensus view of our people, at least in this stage of history. That's kind of the language of you see in the second Hamas charter, which was written in 2000, the current Hamas charter, which was written in 2017. So I think that ultimately, there are always in any case, in any situation, there are extremists. The question is, those extremists can sometimes be forced to evolve, or at least marginalized, if there is a movement of mass public opinion in a certain direction.
So I want to shift our conversation a little bit to something else that you're really expert on. In 2010, you wrote an article in the New York Review of Books titled "The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment." And both Rabbi Altshuler and I met you soon after you shared your what was then kind of considered a radical opinion that young Jews were not feeling connected to Israel, and that there was really a generational divide. And you were already starting to see this back then. A lot of people were upset with what you were saying. And yet over these years, we've seen that it was really prescient. I mean, you were understanding something that I think a lot of the American Jewish community had not yet seen. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, both then and now? What were you seeing that a lot of the American Jewish establishment was not aware of? And where do we find ourselves now? One of the big challenges that we have in trying to address in our own communities, Israel in general over the years, and Israel and the situation in Israel and Gaza since October 7th, is that there's a huge divide generationally. We're having a hard time in our families and in our communities finding ways for people cross-generationally to communicate and to find words to express their opinions when they're so heated and so different. Can you talk about that? I mean, what's been going on for these last 15 years?
I mean, I think that older American Jews grew up at a time when they were more likely to see Israel as an embattled and a country that was potentially threatened by its more powerful collective Arab neighbors. Maybe they had experienced 1967 or 1973, and they. And I think younger Jews have grown up seeing Israel as a regional superpower. So I think that's part of the difference. They've also grown up seeing Israel as, since 2009, basically Israel has been run by the Israeli right, by Netanyahu, with a 1-year exception. So they also don't have a memory of the kind of liberal, kibbutznik, socialist Israel that also may resonate for older Jews doesn't really exist for them. For them, Israel looks like the kind of right-wing country that most of them don't want America to be, a country. And so Netanyahu, because of his very Americanism, often looks like a Republican politician to a lot of Americans. So I think that's part of the reason for the shift. I also think that Palestinians are a little bit more present in American discourse than they were. Edward Said in 1982 famously wrote that Palestinians lack permission to narrate in the United States. And to a significant degree, that's still true. But I think if you go on college campuses, for instance, although we're often told that the experience of Jews and Palestinians is one in which the Jews are kind of terrified by all of the pro-Palestine kind of anti-Semitism, I actually think that oftentimes what happens is that there's actually real learning and dialogue, and that younger people are much more likely to have a Palestinian kid down the hall or in their class than their parents or grandparents, and they learn from that person about what the Palestinian experience is like. And I think I will say that for Jews of almost any generation, I have found that a meaningful engagement with Palestinians under conditions where you can actually really talk and listen and learn are often very, very transformative. And I don't know, for people listening on this call, I would just say, if you've not had those experiences, I would really urge you the next time you are in Israel, go and spend a day in the West Bank. It's really very, very doable. There are lots of people who'd be happy to take you, different organizations. And I think that experience of being able to humanize Palestinians, see them as truly human, and also have a sense of what it's like to live under the control of a state that is not accountable to you, that basically a state where you have no human rights, is a shocking experience for people. And I think younger people are more likely to have had those experiences I think, than older people are.
To follow on Rabbi Graf's question, I'm curious, given the schism that you described then and that we all see now, where do you see things going in terms of American Jewish sense of belonging and identity, especially as it relates to the Israel-Palestine issue?
Well, first of all, I think that this era of a Zionist consensus, by Zionist, I mean a Jewish support for a Jewish state or a Jewish supremacist state. I think that there is a significant amount of consensus among older American Jews, let's say middle age and up. But among younger American Jews, there is not a consensus. Now, that's not to say that all of them, or even a majority of young American Jews, are anti-Zionist, but a very substantial minority are. So there was a 2021 poll, for instance, on the question of Israel, is Israel an apartheid state? Among American Jews between 18 and 35, 38% said it was an apartheid state and 47% said it wasn't. So you have a pretty substantial cleavage. So I think the first thing is we have to understand is that Israel, which has historically been seen as a unifying force among American Jews, I think is increasingly becoming a divisive force. And then the question, I think, for the Jewish community is, what can Jews build our institutions around that can bring us together? We should have arguments and conversations about Israel, but it's not going to be, I think, a source of unity in the way that it might have been in the past. And I would, what I would like to see Jewish institutions investing in is bringing people from all different political perspectives and religious perspectives together around the study of Jewish texts, because I think ultimately what we fundamentally most share is these set of texts that have sustained our people for far, far longer than the state of Israel, that are much deeper and more ancient than the state of Israel, and that we need to engage those texts, I think, together, because they're the texts, I think, that actually have sustained our people and that can give us a vision of what it means to live a meaningful Jewish life. I think that in terms of the nature of the American Jewish relationship with society at large, I think we are headed into some very difficult waters, because American Jews have been able for 100 years or so to comfortably assert pretty much anywhere that they were both Zionists and that they were liberals or progressives, right? That they had those values. The problem is that a larger and larger percentage of the American liberal or progressive population looks at Israel, especially given what it's doing in Gaza now, and sees Zionism as the state ideology of that government, sees that Israel has been called an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Israel's own leading human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, for instance, and says you can't be a liberal or progressive in good standing and support Zionism. And that, I think, is creating a sense of discomfort, even alienation, in progressive spaces that I think is going to be very, very difficult for a lot of American Jews. You see it you're starting to see it more on college campuses, but I think it will, because of this, I think it will move from college campuses into a whole range of progressive institutions. And the organized American Jewish community's dominant response to this has been to try to suppress Palestinian speech. So the Anti-Defamation League is going around trying to get colleges to ban their chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine, right? That's their response. I don't think that's a good response. I think it violates the principles of free speech. And I think actually our response should be, we need to start having in our own institutions, in our Jewish schools, our after-school programs, our camps, a much more honest conversation with young people about what Zionism actually is as a lived reality for Palestinians, not as kind of a vague notion that we might have, but actually of what it actually means to, as Said said, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Because if we don't understand that and we don't teach that to our own children, they're in for a very rude awakening, I think, as they move into college and into other progressive spaces.
Can we talk a little bit about anti-Semitism in America? Where is it coming from? What can the role of the American Jewish response be? And how do we navigate that at a time of challenge also in Israel and, simultaneously happening, Israel, Gaza, the Palestinians, and what's happening in America?
Sure. So I think that part of the reason there's so much debate about how much anti-Semitism there is because there are different definitions of anti-Semitism, right? So if you define anti-Zionism, which is opposition to a Jewish state, as anti-Semitism, you're going to see a lot more anti-Semitism on the left than in the pro-Palestine movement. Indeed, you might see myself, as someone who's espousing anti-Semitism. You would certainly have to see the Satmar Hasidim as also anti-Semitic because they also don't support a Jewish state. And you would have to define all Palestinians as anti-Semites because essentially all Palestinians are going to be anti-Zionist. So if you think anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism like the ADL does, all Palestinians are anti-Semites because Palestinians are anti-Zionist. How could they not be anti-Zionist? Even if we think Zionism has been great for Jews, it's certainly not been good for them. It started with their mass expulsion in 1948 and has gone downhill from there. So part of the question in terms of thinking about how much there is has to do with this definition. If you define anti-Semitism not as including anti-Zionism, but I think in a more traditional way, which is along a set of metrics, like, do you believe that Jews are honest? Do you believe that Jews are loyal? Do you believe that Jews can be trusted? These kind of things. Do you believe that Jews wield too much power in the United States? If you ask those more traditional questions, or just a thermometer test, how do you feel about Jews? Then you actually find that anti-Semitism is much, much higher on the right. And the best research that I've seen on this is from a guy, a political scientist at Tufts named Eitan Hirsch, and a graduate student at Harvard named Laura Royden. They find that anti-Semitism is much, along that metric, much, much higher on the right than on the left, which in some ways shouldn't be surprising because we would not expect to find an equal amount of anti-Black racism on the left and on the right, or anti-LGBT sentiment, right? The left is by nature equality-oriented, and the right is hierarchy-oriented. So I start with the view that there is much, much more anti-Semitism on the right than on the left. That's not to say there is no anti-Semitism on the left. There is anti-Semitism on the left. And unfortunately, that anti-Semitism, pro-Palestine anti-Semitism, tends to go up when there's more violence in Israel, in Israel-Palestine. In fact, there are 3 studies, one from Australia, one from Belgium, one from the United States, that show a particular correlation between the number of Palestinians killed by the IDF and the number of reported anti-Semitic attacks. And so what is happening there? It's possible that some people were always anti-Semitic and they have got an excuse now because of Israel's actions. I also think that some people are not making a clear distinction between Israel, the policies of a state, and ordinary Jews or ordinary institutions. And that's anti-Semitic. Jews are not responsible for what Israel does any more than Chinese Americans are responsible for what the People's Republic of China does, or Muslim Americans are responsible for what Pakistan or Saudi Arabia does. It's anti-Semitic to hold Jews responsible for the actions of a state. And we have to be very clear, it seems to me, about that distinction. The problem I think we have as an organized Jewish community is we want other people to be clear about the distinction, but we're not clear about it ourselves, right? Because oftentimes people in the American Jewish establishment will say that being a Zionist or being a supporter of a Jewish state is an inherent part of Jewishness, right? It's not a choice that a Jew can make as one expression of Jewishness. It is the essence of Jewishness. It's inherent in being Jewish. And if you do that, actually you are making the very kind of conflation that I think we need to demand that people not make about us. The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Ephraim Mervis, said a while back that Zionism, not Zion, but Zionism leaps from every page of the Siddur, of the Jewish prayer book. If you say that Zionism leaps from every page of the Siddur, then why shouldn't someone write Free Palestine on a prayer book? You just said it's a Zionist political document. And that seems to me one of the problems in our own discourse that we need to sort out as we fight against the anti-Semitism that holds Jews responsible for what Israel does.
I'm looking at the questions that are coming in from the audience, and a lot of people are asking about your views of Zionism and whether you think Zionism is inherently oppressive to Palestinians, and whether you think there are forms of Zionism that aren't oppressive to Palestinians.
That's a great question. So yes, I think there are forms of Zionism that are not oppressive to Palestinians. Indeed, I myself would identify as a cultural Zionist. This is a tradition, again, starts with the writer who went by the name of Echad Ha'am and continues with people like Buber, Magnus, Schultz, Hannah Arendt at a time, Albert Einstein for a time, who called themselves Zionists because they believed in the importance of a Jewish society in Israel-Palestine that could do a kind of cultural production. This is what Echad Ha'am talked about. Of course, famous, for instance, creating Hebrew as a modern language. But they didn't believe in a state that favored Jews over Palestinians. They believed in an equal binational state, as I do. But that was the Zionism, that was the path. And if people are interested in this, there's a very interesting book by a Hebrew University historian named Dmitry Shumsky which traces actually this idea of Zionism as separate from the idea of Jewish statehood. But of course, that's not the Zionism that came to pass in 1948. The only Zionism we have known is the Zionism of Jewish supremacy. And no, I don't. And that Zionism, I think, tragically is inherently oppressive because it is based on the notion that the state has a higher level of obligations to Jews than it does to Palestinians. In its most extreme form, that most of the Palestinians under Israeli control are not even citizens of the state in which they live. But even in Israel proper, that those Palestinians who are citizens are not citizens who are treated equally. I'll give you just one quick example. 93% of the land inside Israel proper, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza now, inside Israel proper, is state land. Actually, much of it was taken from Palestinians when they were expelled in 1948, because the Jews only lived on about 6% of the land before Israel's War of Independence. So much of it was land that was the Palestinians controlled. Now it's called state land. It's doled out for development in Israel by something called the Israel Land Authority. So basically, the Israel Land Authority, if you're like a town or maybe even an industry, you want a chunk of land, you give it a long-term lease by the Israel Land Authority so you can expand into this territory. The Israel Land Authority has 22 seats. 10 of those seats are given to the Jewish National Fund. Now, the Jewish National Fund's explicit mission is the development of land for Jewish use. The other 12 are given to members of the cabinet. There's mostly not one Palestinian on the Israel Land Authority. Sometimes there's one. So that's why Palestinians are not given land for development in Israel, which helps to explain why Palestinian municipalities sit on 2 or 3% of the land inside Israel, even though Palestinians are 20% of the population. Helps explain why, according to a study I saw, 87% of the home demolitions inside Israel proper, I'm not talking about the West Bank, inside Israel proper, are of Palestinian homes, because Palestinians are essentially the Palestinians are in very, very overcrowded, essentially ghettos. And all of the land around those Palestinian towns is controlled by Jews, and Palestinians can't get access to any of that land. And that's the way the state doesn't function for them. It's a state that essentially functions for the benefit of Jews, not for the benefit even of its own Palestinian citizens, let alone the Palestinians who don't have citizenship.
Okay, I have a different question now, a different direction to go in with this. You are obviously very well read, very knowledgeable about Middle Eastern history and politics, but in fact, you are not a Middle Eastern history professor. You are a journalism professor, right?
And political science professor. Yeah.
Okay.
Teach journalism and political science. Yeah.
Really interested in with your journalism hat on in your comments about the war and what we're seeing. We've seen shocking images on both sides, and a kind of interest in continuing to shock, especially on October 7th with the film videoing of atrocities by the terrorists themselves, and the subsequent ways that shocking news has been reported. Can you comment on what we're seeing from a journalism perspective, how all these images are impacting us, how we are understanding this conflict through the way that it's being reported?
I mean, I think one thing that's really important to remember is that American media doesn't really have access to Gaza. So in terms of the kind of the capacity to it was much easier for American media to show at a kind of human level the videos of the horrors that are committed on October 6th, but because of the way Israel controls access into Gaza, American reporters can't really get access into Gaza. Now, there are Palestinian reporters in Gaza who are producing some of that. And so that's where we do get some images from kind of ground level. But oftentimes the images in American media you're going to get of Gaza are much more like to be taken from the air, kind of and the Palestinian journalists who have been on the ones on the ground trying to produce that that footage have been being killed at an astonishing rate. I think maybe more than 150 Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed since the war began. So I think that has an impact on how we see things. I think different media institutions are, kind of cover this story in different ways. And to be frank, there's a lot of internal pressure inside different media organizations about how they cover this story, and some of that pressure comes from establishment American Jewish organizations that I think want Israeli Jews and their suffering to be humanized, which of course they should be, but tend to respond much more negatively when Palestinians and Palestinian suffering is humanized.
So I'm looking again at the questions that have been submitted, and we've received a number of questions about the right to return in Israel and Israel as a refuge for Jews around the world. So I'm curious, how do you respond to people's concerns about Israel continuing to be a refuge for Jews, given this one state idea?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Israel. First of all, I don't think that Israel, I think, will be a very effective refuge for Jews if Israel is in a situation of great violence. For instance, if you think back to the first, I mean, there are many fewer Jews. If you think about the Second Intifada, for instance, between 2000 and 2004, many fewer Jews around the world, I think, would have seen Israel as a refuge then. And I think that the path on which we're headed, which is basically a path in which Israel ever deepens its domination of Palestinians, is actually a situation in which we're likely headed for more and more violence. I mean, as horrifying as October 7th was, I think we haven't even contemplated the possibility of what will happen if the Palestinian Authority collapses in the West Bank. Because the Palestinian Authority, which acts as Israel's subcontractor, is really what is preventing much more significant armed resistance from the West Bank. And I don't think the Palestinian Authority can last another decade. It's completely delegitimized in the ideas of in the eyes of Palestinians. So I think that if we think about a refuge, we have to think about what will make this territory safe for Jews. And I actually genuinely believe, again, although it's obviously a minority view, I genuinely believe the Israeli Jews will be safer under conditions of legal equality, which would mean that any Jews who go to Israel-Palestine will be safer than under a condition of violence and armed resistance and war. I don't think that what Jews need to be safe is for any one of us to be able to fly to Ben Gurion Airport and become a citizen on day one with no questions asked, while Palestinians, even Palestinians born inside Israel, can't return. I don't think we need that for our safety. What I would like to see in an equal binational state, and I write about this in Yavna, would be the principle that any Jew or any Palestinian around the world who was in distress, who was not safe, could go to the front of the line and become and go and gain refugee status and then citizenship immediately. I think that's what Jews need to be safe. We don't need a situation in which any Jew around the world can become a citizen on day one. It seems to me the rest of us who are not in danger, we can, if we want to become Israelis, we can go through a normal immigration process.
What do you think American Jews can and should do at this moment to work towards justice and stability in the region? What's our role?
I mean, I think in the longer term, my answer to this is always to listen to Palestinians. But I think in this particular moment, I think the fundamental moral obligation is to stop this war. Abraham Joshua Heschel said during Vietnam that every time he opened the Siddur, every time he opened a prayer book, he saw images of Vietnamese children burned with napalm. And I think that that is the way we should feel about what's being done in our name, and because it's being done by a Jewish state and in many cases with American weapons. Alex DeWall, who's an expert on famine at Tufts, has said that this is the most rapid man-made famine since World War II. Palestinians are starving to death. Many Palestinians are eating one meal a day. People may have noticed that there was a stampede in which maybe more than 100 people were killed today. That stampede started because people were desperately trying to get to aid trucks to procure food. People are now making bread in Gaza with animal feed. 10 children per day are having their limbs amputated. Doctors are operating without anesthesia. This is a profound crisis, a profound moral crisis for the United States. and for us as Jews. This, I believe, will haunt us for the rest of our days, what is being done in Gaza. And so I think we need to do everything we can to stop it. And if I were the Biden administration, I would say, not one more American bullet will be used to continue this war, and that we will not shield the people who are carrying out this war from international prosecution if they are considered to be violating the laws of the laws of war and human rights. By the way, the International Court of Justice said that Israel put an injunction on Israel to continue acts that could be deemed genocide. And since that time, thousands more Palestinians have been killed. So that to me is the urgent question of the day. I know there are people who believe that this is tragic, but it's just necessary because this is what it will take to keep Israel safe because of what Hamas did on October 7th. I would just ask you this. Find me a single Palestinian who believes that. You find me a single Palestinian who believes this war is going to make Israel more safe. It's a sick joke. Any Palestinian you talk to will tell you that this war is going to make Israel less safe because of the profound hatred that it is producing as a whole generation of children, many of them amputated and maimed, grow up without parents. And how do you think they're going to think about Israel?
Well, I just want to ask you as a follow-up, while we must have empathy for civilians and everywhere who are caught in this and every war, why is the international community not calling for the immediate release of the Israeli hostages?
Well, the United States has, and I think the UN Security Council and the UN have indeed called for the immediate release of the hostages. Absolutely. It's also, and of course, I support the immediate release of the hostages. The war would not end with the immediate release of the hostages because Israel's stated goal its number one stated goal is destroying Hamas. Its number two stated goal is releasing the hostages. The truth is, the only way the hostages are actually going to be released is if there is a long-term pause in fighting, and if Palestinians, some number of Palestinian prisoners, are released from Israeli jails. And I would note that many of those Palestinians, any of those who were arrested in the West Bank, were prosecuted under military law in which they had no due process. They're not citizens. The prosecution rate in those military courts is above 99%. So those Palestinians who were in Israeli jails were not prosecuted under anything remotely like a due process system. And if Israel wants to get the hostages released realistically, it will have to release some of those Palestinian prisoners too. And it can start with elderly prisoners. It can start with women and children. There are a lot of ways there. Israel still holds Palestinians and children in its prisons. It could start with them.
So we have to wrap up in a minute or so, but I'm curious, what in this moment gives you hope?
The thing that gives me hope is when I see Jews protesting the war. And I'll tell you a story. I was talking to a doctor in Gaza, a man who had really was living in unspeakable circumstances. He himself was one of these people who was performing surgeries without anesthesia. He had been forced out of his home. He was living in a tent. He's now desperately trying to get his family out, as many Palestinians are, to save their lives. And I asked him what he noticed about the international response. And he said that he noticed that there were Jews who were protesting against the war. And he said, when I saw that, I told people in my own family, this is not a fight of Jews against Palestinians. Jews are not our enemies. This is about a set of principles, about the dignity of all human life, about people's right to freedom. And I believe that although many of the people who are now protesting this war, the Jews who are blocking streets or causing some commotion, many of them people look at them as traitors or nuisances or whatever. They are doing more to fight anti-Semitism than anyone else in our community, because they are showing that this is not a struggle of tribe against tribe, of us versus them. It's a struggle about certain moral principles. And I think I mentioned that I'm the child of South Africans. a critical part of the reason that Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress never succumbed to the racialism that existed in some parts of the Black South African population that essentially wanted to replace apartheid with a form of Black domination was that Mandela had seen in his own life white South Africans willing to put their bodies on the line to fight apartheid. Many of them, by the way, were Jewish white South Africans. And that showed him that you could not paint all white people as the enemy. This is the Jews who are fighting this war are doing that. They are sending a message to Palestinians and indeed to Arabs and Muslims all over the world that is fundamentally important for our own safety and in the battle against anti-Semitism.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. As Rabbi Graf said at the top of this is about starting conversation and hearing from various perspectives, and we definitely have a lot to think about after tonight. So thank you so much for this. And I know it's late on the East Coast, so we'll let you scurry off to bed. So thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you all check out our future interviews.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with
Sure.
us. To you,
My pleasure.
Professor Beinart, and to all of you who have joined us tonight. Good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night.